Every era of rugby has its own legends, storylines, and iconic moments, but the 2000s might have just been the best of them all. In the 2000s, we witnessed the peak of rugby's most iconic players, Jonny Wilkinson, Richie McCaw, Bryan Habana, and so on, alongside the rise of both the professional era's first superstar generation. We witnessed the greatest international tournaments ever, as well as the fiercest rivalries, legendary tackles, impossible comebacks, and iconic celebrations, all make up just a fraction of what makes this the greatest era in rugby history. So, starting from 2000 and working our way through the decade, this is the full recap of the 2000s. At the turn of the millennium, rugby union was changing, and fast. The sport was rapidly moving away from the 20th century traditions, where players spent weekends representing local clubs for little more than pride and pints. Fans stood on crumbling terraces in all weather, and corporate influence was practically non-existent, because the 1995 Declaration of Professionalism, along with increased television interest and the creation of lucrative competitions like the Heineken Cup and Super 12, meant revenue streams and financial opportunities for clubs and players were surging. Yet, clubs and owners weren't the only beneficiaries of the sport's sudden influx of cash. Player salaries and social statuses transcended what was previously achievable from rugby union, and the first generation of celebrity-like rugby superstars was born. By 2000, players like Jonah Lomu, John Eales, and Keith Wood were globally recognised through their performances and sponsorship deals with major international brands. And as rugby responded to the impacts of professionalisation, the emphasis on domestic competitions diminished slightly, as all of the world's elite clubs became obsessed with winning continental glory. The financial incentives for achieving success in the Heineken Cup or Super Rugby became so significant they could transform an entire franchise for years. And come the year 2000, the rugby world was about to witness a new beginning. Italy joined the Five Nations to create the Six Nations Championship, expanding Northern Hemisphere rugby into a new era of competition. But the real action was happening down south. Australia and New Zealand were dominating the Tri-Nations, with the legendary John Eales leading the Wallabies with a level of tactical genius rarely seen from a second row forward. The rivalry between these two nations reached its absolute peak on July 15, 2000, when they met at Stadium Australia in front of a world record rugby crowd of 109,874 screaming fans. The match would go down in history as the match of the century. The All Blacks exploded out of the gates, racing to a 24-0 lead within just 10 minutes as the Wallabies looked completely overwhelmed. But this was John Eales' team, and they never quit. Australia clawed their way back, incredibly levelling the score at 24-all by half-time in one of the most dramatic comebacks ever witnessed. The second half turned into an absolute tri-fest, with the lead changing hands multiple times. And fittingly, it was the great Jonah Lomu who scored the decisive try in the dying minutes to secure a 39-35 victory for New Zealand. The intensity, the skill, the sheer drama. This was rugby at its absolute finest. Meanwhile, in the club game, the Crusaders completed a stunning three-peat in Super 12, winning their third consecutive title under the brilliant coaching of Robbie Deans. Their dominance was total. Their rugby was breathtaking, and they were setting a new standard for professional rugby in the Southern Hemisphere. Over in Europe, France and England were quietly building towards something special, while South Africa remained in transition after their disappointing 1999 World Cup campaign. But the stage was set for an unforgettable decade. 2001 arrived. The British and Irish Lions toured Australia in an emotionally charged series that captivated the rugby world. The Wallabies, led by Eales, defeated the Lions 2-1, cementing Australia's status as the premier rugby nation on the planet. But for Eales, the year would end in the most perfect way imaginable. In his final match against New Zealand in Sydney, with the Bledisloe Cup on the line, number 8 Tutai Kefu scored a last-minute try to secure the win, retired at the absolute peak of his powers. Eales finished his career as a two-time World Cup winner, scoring 173 points for Australia and one of the most respected captains to ever grace the sport. But while one legend retired, new stars were emerging. A young flanker named Richie McCaw made his debut for New Zealand against Ireland and was immediately named Man of the Match, despite having played just a few provincial games. His work rate, his tactical intelligence, his ability to dominate the breakdown, it was all there from day one. And in Ireland, Brian O'Driscoll continued his ascendancy after his stunning hat-trick in Paris the previous year, proving that the 2000s would belong to a new generation of superstars. Keith Wood was named the first ever IRB World Player of the Year, but 2001 was only the beginning, because by 2002, the world was preparing for something truly extraordinary. The Crusaders went undefeated. Not a single loss across all 13 matches, 11 regular season and 2 finals. It was the perfect season, a display of rugby dominance so complete that it seemed almost unfair. The seamless transition from the era of Andrew Mehrtens and Todd Blackadder to the era of Richie McCaw and a young Dan Carter, proved that the Crusaders weren't just a team, they were a dynasty. Meanwhile, France claimed their first Six Nations Grand Slam of the millennium, and New Zealand's Black Ferns won the Women's Rugby World Cup. But the year was bittersweet for rugby fans everywhere as the great Jonah Lomu's international career effectively came to an end. 63 caps, 37 tries, and a legacy that transcended the sport. The legend had finally hung up his boots. Now, the stage was set for the biggest tournament in rugby history, the 2003 Rugby World Cup in Australia. England arrived as the overwhelming favourites under the meticulous coaching of Sir Clive Woodward. This wasn't just a team, it was a project, years in the making. Woodward had invested in specialised coaches for every aspect of the game, and at the heart of it all stood Martin Johnson, the uncompromising lock whose mere presence intimidated opposition packs. This was a forward pack featuring the brutality of Neil Back, the technical mastery of Jason Leonard, combined with a backline orchestrated by the goal-kicking perfection of Jonny Wilkinson. England looked unstoppable. The pool stages were ruthless. Australia demolished Namibia 142-0. England ground through their pool matches with efficiency rather than flair, conceding just one try in 4 matches. This was pragmatic rugby, built on the principle that championships are won through defence and discipline. But as the knockout rounds approached, the tournament shifted dramatically. Gone was the free-flowing rugby of the pools. Instead, tactical kicking, penalty battles, and conservative game plans dominated. This was attritional rugby, where every point mattered and every mistake could cost you the trophy. England survived a ferocious quarter-final against Wales, then faced France in the semis in a brutal encounter that saw them grind out a 24-7 victory through sheer forward dominance. Meanwhile, Australia dispatched New Zealand in the other semi-final, setting up a final that had everything: history, rivalry, home advantage. No European nation had ever lifted the Webb Ellis Cup. The pressure on England was immense. November 22, 2003, Telstra Stadium, Sydney. The match started with devastating intensity. Both sides traded penalties, neither able to establish dominance. Wilkinson kicked with metronomic precision, keeping England in touch, and the tension was unbearable. The second half remained deadlocked, a chess match between two exhausted sides giving everything they had. The pressure was suffocating. England edged ahead through another Wilkinson penalty, but Australia refused to yield. Elton Flatley kicked a penalty to level at 17-17. Then, England won a line out deep in Australian territory. Jonny Wilkinson, positioned just inside the Australian 22, his right boot poised. The crowd held its breath. Matt Dawson presented the ball, Wilkinson swung his leg, striking it with his non-dominant right foot. The final whistle blew, and in that instant, history was made as England became the first Northern Hemisphere team to lift the Webb Ellis Cup. The impact was seismic. This was the peak of Northern Hemisphere professional structures. Martin Johnson lifted the trophy and retired immediately as an immortal legend of the game. England's triumph was monumental. South Africa came roaring back in 2004, winning the Tri-Nations for the first time in 6 years under the tactical blueprint of coach Jake White. The fetcher flanker role, personified by Schalk Burger, who was named IRB Player of the Year, became the most vital position on the field. The ability to win turnovers at the breakdown was now the difference between victory and defeat. Meanwhile, the Brumbies defeated the Crusaders 47-38 in a Super 12 final that was an absolute try-scoring thriller, proving that attacking rugby could still thrive even as defences tightened across the globe. But 2005 would belong to one man, Dan Carter. The British and Irish Lions toured New Zealand, and rugby fans everywhere expected a competitive series. What they got was a 3-0 blackout, a complete annihilation by the All Blacks. And at the centre of it all was Dan Carter's performance in the second test in Wellington, a display so perfect that experts are still talking about it today. 33 points, 2 tries, 5 penalties, 4 conversions. The Lions had no answer. Carter didn't just play rugby that night, he conquered it. The performance cemented his status as the greatest fly half of his generation and set a new standard for what the number 10 position could achieve. Elsewhere, Wales won their first Grand Slam in 27 years under Mike Ruddock, and Richie McCaw was appointed captain of the All Blacks in 2006, beginning a leadership era that would define New Zealand rugby for over a decade. The 2006 season gave rugby fans one of the most bizarre and unforgettable moments in the sport's history. The Super 14 final between the Crusaders and Hurricanes in Christchurch was played in thick sea fog that made the match nearly impossible to see for spectators and commentators alike. The ball completely disappeared into the mist. The Crusaders won 19-12, but the fog final became the stuff of legend. Meanwhile, in Europe, Munster finally achieved their holy grail. After heartbreaking losses in the 2000 and 2002 Heineken Cup finals, they defeated Biarritz 23-19 to claim European glory. The emotion was overwhelming. The entire Munster squad had endured years of pain, and their redemption was complete. And then came 2007, the year of the Springboks. South Africa entered the Rugby World Cup in France as a defensive powerhouse, built on a brutal forward pack led by the second-row partnership of Victor Matfield and Bakkies Botha, widely considered the most feared lock pairing in rugby history. And up front, the ageless Randt, returning from retirement at 35 years old, anchored a scrum that could dominate any opposition. Behind them, Bryan Habana was at the absolute peak of his powers, a finisher so deadly that defenders knew he was coming and still couldn't stop him. The tournament was unpredictable from the start. Argentina stunned hosts France 17-12 in the opening match in Paris, announcing themselves as legitimate contenders. But the tournament truly exploded in the quarter-finals. France faced New Zealand in Cardiff, and what followed was the greatest upset in All Blacks history. The All Blacks couldn't handle the ferocity of the French forward pack or the tactical kicking of their backline. France won 20-18, and the shock reverberated around the rugby world. The World Cup curse that had haunted New Zealand since their 1987 triumph continued, and another generation of All Blacks legends would retire without the ultimate prize. South Africa demolished Argentina in their semi-final, while England, against all expectations, ground their way past France in a defensive masterclass to reach their second consecutive World Cup final. The final at the Stade de France on October 20th was never going to be a tri-fest. England started strongly, but South Africa's scrum began to assert dominance, winning penalty after penalty. Percy Montgomery, the veteran fullback, kicked with unerring accuracy. England had a try by Mark Cueto disallowed by the television match official. And when the final whistle blew, South Africa had won 15-6 to claim their second World Cup title. Bryan Habana finished the tournament with 8 tries, equaling Jonah Lomu's record set in 1999. While Victor Matfield was named man of the match in the final, South Africa were world champions, and the Springbok dynasty of the late 2000s was just beginning. Back in the club game, the Bulls claimed their first Super 14 title, establishing a dominance in South African rugby that would last for years. And as 2007 came to a close, 2 legends bid farewell. Randt retired as a 2-time world champion, having won in 1995 and then again in 2007, and George Gregan, Australia's greatest scrum half, retired with a then record 139 caps. In 2008, Wales claimed the Six Nations Grand Slam under Warren Gatland, while New Zealand completed a Grand Slam tour of the United Kingdom and Ireland. And Robbie Deans, the mastermind behind the Crusaders dynasty, left New Zealand to coach Australia, a move that shocked the rugby world. In 2009, Ireland won their first Grand Slam since 1948, captained by the legendary Brian O'Driscoll. The emotion, the pride, the sheer relief of ending 61 years of failure. O'Driscoll, who had carried the weight of Irish rugby on his shoulders for nearly a decade, he was named Six Nations Player of the tournament for the 3rd time, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest centres to ever play the game. But just months later, the British and Irish Lions toured South Africa in what would become one of the most physical and brutal series ever played. The Lions, captained by Paul O'Connell, arrived with genuine belief they could defeat the world champions on their own soil. The first test in Durban was a defensive arm wrestle that South Africa won 26-21. The second test in Pretoria would decide the series. The Lions played out of their skins. The physicality was brutal. Players from both sides left everything on the field. But South Africa, champions that they were, refused to yield. They clawed their way back into the match, with Moornstein's goal kicking keeping them within striking distance. As the clock ticked into the final minute, the scores were tied at 25-25. Then, in the 80-minute, Lions fly half Ronan O'Gara was penalised for a mid-air collision on Dupree's. The penalty was awarded on halfway, 53 metres from the posts. Moornstein, just 25 years old, stepped up to take what would be the most pressure-filled kick of his career. Stein's run-up was calm. Measured, he struck the ball cleanly, and it sailed through the posts. South Africa had won 28-25. The Lions players collapsed to their knees, devastated. They had come so close to forcing a deciding third test, but in the end, Stein's ice-cold composure had broken their hearts. South Africa had won the series 2-1, and their dominance of world rugby was complete. It was a cruel end to a heroic Lions effort, but it perfectly encapsulated the brutality and drama of Test rugby at the highest level. The year also saw the infamous Bloodgate scandal, where Harlequins player Tom Williams bit a fake blood capsule to facilitate a tactical substitution. It was a stark reminder that the pressure to win in the professional era could push players and coaches to the very edge of acceptable behaviour. But South Africa's success continued as they claimed the Tri-Nations title with a clean sweep of 3 consecutive victories over New Zealand, a feat that solidified their status status as the premier side of the late 2000s. The 2000s produced legends whose names will echo through rugby history forever. Richie McCaw, the flanker from rural New Zealand who revolutionised the role of the open side, forcing the entire sport to adapt its rucking laws. Bryan Habana, the South African predator whose 22 mph top speed made him unstoppable. Dan Carter, the perfect fly half who became the all-time leading point scorer in Test rugby and redefined what the number 10 position could achieve. Jonny Wilkinson, the perfectionist from Surrey whose obsessive training routines and mental resilience set a new standard for professionalism. Brian O'Driscoll, the wizard from Dublin, who reimagined the outside centre position as a defensive jackal, and Martin Johnson, the enforcer, whose uncompromising leadership delivered England their first and only World Cup. These weren't just athletes, they were icons who transcended the sport. John Eales, the lock who kicked goals and captained Australia to 2 World Cups. Victor Matfield, the line-out technician who spent hours studying opposition calls. Randt, the Ox, the only Springbok to win World Cups 12 years apart. These men didn't just play rugby, they defined an era. The 2000s was the decade where rugby union finally grew up. The Crusaders dominated Super Rugby with 7 titles. Munster's emotional journey to Heineken Cup glory in 2006 and 2008 proved that passion and resilience could overcome any obstacle. The Bulls' tactical mastery under Fury Dupreez and Morn Stein established South African supremacy in the club game. The culture of rugby transformed during this decade. Legendary tackles, impossible comebacks, tactical revolutions, and iconic celebrations all combined to create the greatest era in rugby history. Players like Richie McCaw, Dan Carter, and Bryan O'Driscoll didn't just dominate the game, they redefined what it meant to be a rugby player. And as the decade closed with Ireland's Grand Slam and South Africa's dominance, the stage was set for a new generation to carry the torch. This was the 2000s. This was rugby's golden age, and we'll never see an era quite like it again.